Hello friends, I am John Mearsheimer. Europe has no idea yet, but it has already lost a war. Not a war fought on its own borders, but in Ukraine. And the most unsettling part is that the defeat did not happen on the battlefield. It happened at the decision-making table. For years, European leaders insisted that Ukraine is the red line, that if Kiev fell, Europe's security would fall with it. But today, the facts are undeniable. Ukraine is being torn apart, and with it the strategic vision on which Europe has relied for the last 3 decades. So the question is no longer, can Ukraine win? The question is, what kind of Europe will emerge after Ukraine loses? Because when a continent builds its future on a flawed assumption, someone eventually pays the price, and that bill is starting to arrive. Let us begin with a fact that is rarely spoken openly. Ukraine as a functioning state has already collapsed, not symbolically, not metaphorically, but materially, economically, and demographically. And any discussion about its future must first recognize this reality, not as an opinion, but as the baseline from which serious analysis must start. Ukraine has already lost a large portion of its land, and every military indicator suggests that additional territory will be lost before this conflict reaches its frozen conclusion. Crimea is gone, the Donbass is gone, the land corridor to the Sea of Azov secured. And if Russia believes Europe will remain committed to propping up the remaining Ukrainian state, then Moscow will have every incentive to take more Odessa, Kharkiv, and the oblasts in between. The logic is straightforward. If Russia expects Europe to stand behind Ukraine indefinitely, then Russia has a structural interest in weakening Ukraine permanently by ensuring that whatever remains of it cannot pose any threat to Moscow, cannot enter NATO, and cannot integrate economically with the European Union. This is not emotional reasoning. It is cold strategy, and cold strategy usually prevails. Ukraine had a severe demographic problem long before the war. Birth rates had fallen drastically in the decades following independence. Millions had left the country for economic reasons. The population was already aging rapidly. The war accelerated all of it. Recent estimates suggest close to 1 million military casualties, a staggering figure, not just for a country of Ukraine's size, but for a population already described as being in a demographic death spiral. Add to this the millions who fled the country, many of them young, many highly educated, and you begin to understand the magnitude of the damage. A nation can survive the loss of territory. It can even survive the loss of infrastructure. But losing its people, that is the deepest wound of all, and it may be irreversible. The economic picture is equally dire. Ukraine's GDP has contracted dramatically. Key industries have been destroyed or seized. Agricultural output, once one of Ukraine's major strengths, has suffered from disrupted logistics, minefields, and damaged ports. Foreign investment is virtually non-existent. Reconstruction would require hundreds of billions of dollars, perhaps more. But reconstruction plans require not just money. They require stability, security, skilled labor, functioning institutions. None of these elements exist, and they will not exist for a long time. Hence the unavoidable truth. Ukraine's economy is not just damaged, it is unlikely to recover in any foreseeable future. Ukraine today survives only because it is supplied, funded, and sustained by external actors, military aid, financial aid, intelligence support. Without this flow of assistance, the state as we currently know it would cease to function almost immediately. This creates a paradox. Ukraine must continue receiving large-scale foreign aid to survive, but the longer it receives that aid, the more dependent and fragile it becomes. Dependency stabilizes temporarily, but it erodes sovereignty over time. At some point, European and American policymakers will face a choice, whether to keep funding Ukraine indefinitely or to gradually shift resources elsewhere, to domestic priorities, to decaying infrastructure, to internal political pressures, or perhaps to the Indo-Pacific, where the United States increasingly sees its future strategic challenge. This is not a question of morality. It is a question of political endurance, and political endurance is finite. Therefore, it becomes reasonable to expect that Ukraine's support will decline gradually, not because the West abandons it, but because the political and economic cost of maintaining the current level of assistance becomes unsustainable. Some argue that after the war, Ukraine will experience a post-conflict reconstruction similar to post-war Europe, perhaps a new Marshall Plan. But this analogy is flawed. Post-World War II, Europe benefited from 4 key conditions that Ukraine does not have: a decisive end to the war, a functioning demographic base with labor and human capital, clear geopolitical borders backed by stable deterrence, American strategic interest in a long-term European recovery. Ukraine possesses none of those today. The war is unlikely to end in a clear formal peace treaty. Its demographic capacity is shattered, its political institutions are fragile, and American strategic priorities are clearly shifting toward Asia. The lesson is simple. What worked in 1948 will not work in 2025. The most likely scenario is not peace, but a frozen conflict, a line of separation, armistice without resolution, a long-term militarized border similar to Korea, but without the industrial backbone that South Korea had. That scenario would keep Ukraine technically alive but strategically paralyzed, dependent, fragmented, and permanently exposed to pressure from Moscow. In this setting, rebuilding becomes nearly impossible. Investors avoid uncertainty. Refugees hesitate to return. Institutions become mechanisms of survival rather than instruments of development. The conflict may freeze, but the crisis will not. Ukraine did not simply lose territory, it lost something deeper. The structural foundation needed to recover. Its demographic base is collapsing. Its economy is shattered. Its institutions depend on foreign life support. And because of that dependence, its sovereignty is limited and likely to shrink further with time. That is the reality any serious analyst must begin with. Ukraine has not only been wrecked by war, it has been redesigned by it, and that redesign is not temporary. One of the most paradoxical outcomes of this war is that Europe's long-term support for Ukraine may end up weakening it rather than strengthening it. That sounds counterintuitive, even uncomfortable, but cold logic often leads to uncomfortable conclusions. Let us start from a basic strategic fact. If Russia believes that Europe will remain firmly aligned with Ukraine for years financially, militarily, and politically, then Moscow has a strong incentive to make sure that Ukraine never emerges as a stable and sovereign state. In other words, the stronger Europe's commitment to Ukraine becomes, the stronger Russia's incentive becomes to make Ukraine permanently weak. Imagine you are sitting in the Kremlin. You know that Europe views Ukraine as a frontline defense against Russian influence. You expect Europe to keep sending money, training troops, supplying weapons, and lobbying for Ukraine's integration into Western institutions. Under those conditions, what do? You do everything possible to ensure that Ukraine becomes and remains a dysfunctional state. You try to prevent its economic recovery. You target its infrastructure. You disrupt its political system. You make it unstable enough that Europe can never safely integrate into NATO or the EU. That is not ideology. It is balance of power reasoning. And in that setting, territory becomes leverage. The more land Russia controls, the weaker the Ukrainian state that survives. This is why cities like Odessa and Kharkiv carry more than symbolic weight. Control them and you control Ukraine's economic future. Lose them and Ukraine loses any chance of serious recovery. Thus, the war is not simply about borders, it is about shaping Ukraine's future capacity to stand on its own feet. A country that must depend on outside funding and outside weapons for its survival gradually loses sovereignty. And the longer that dependency continues, the harder it becomes to reverse. Institutions start to adapt to external lifelines. Budgets are built on foreign aid. Military doctrine is shaped around foreign logistics. Political decisions become aligned with the interests of those who keep the state alive. At first, this looks like international solidarity. Over time, it becomes a structural trap. The irony is that even genuine support, if sustained indefinitely, can transform a state into a protectorate. And when that happens, sovereignty becomes symbolic rather than real. Europe today views Ukraine not just as a partner, but as a kind of moral cause. That may sound noble, but in geopolitics, moral causes often create strategic obligations that cannot be met sustainably. The greater the commitment, the harder it becomes to step back. Yet, the cost of staying committed rises month after month. That puts Europe in an uncomfortable position. It cannot let Ukraine collapse, but it also cannot rebuild it. The result is a pattern that already appears familiar. Enough support to keep Ukraine alive, but not enough to make it strong. Enough assistance to stabilize the conflict, but not enough to solve it. This approach does not end dependency, it institutionalizes it. And from Moscow's perspective, this is the ideal outcome. Ukraine remains weak, Europe remains financially responsible, and Russia maintains the power to destabilize its neighbor whenever needed. The most likely future for Ukraine is not full recovery, but survival in partial form, a fragmented state with limited sovereignty, permanently dependent on external aid, and geographically exposed to pressure from the East. A frozen conflict does not end history, it simply redesigns it. In this context, Ukraine faces a difficult reality. A long-term alliance with Europe will protect it from total collapse, but it might also prevent it from ever becoming fully independent again. The partnership ensures short-term survival, yes, but it risks undermining long-term sovereignty. Dependence can preserve life, but it rarely builds strength. This leads to a profound conclusion. The more Europe commits to Ukraine, the more Russia is incentivized to dismantle it. The more aid Ukraine receives, the harder it becomes to function without it. And the longer the alliance with Europe lasts, the more Ukraine risks turning from a nation into a geopolitical project, one that survives. The relationship between Europe and Russia has not merely deteriorated, it has been structurally poisoned. From now on, both sides will look at each other not as difficult partners, but as strategic adversaries with incompatible security interests. This is not a temporary diplomatic crisis. It is the emergence of a long-term geopolitical condition, stable hostility. Diplomacy once provided space for maneuver, channels for negotiation, compromise, and symbolic cooperation. Those channels have now been largely closed. Sanctions, embargoes, visa bans, suspended agreements all reflect a deeper shift. What was once a difficult partnership is now treated as a permanent threat. Russia believes Europe is part of a broader Western architecture designed to contain and weaken it. Europe believes Russia is an inherently revisionist power that cannot coexist peacefully with democratic neighbors. When states begin to see each other not as competitors but as obstacles, diplomacy loses its function. Strategy replaces conversation. Both sides now have incentives to disrupt each other's stability. This may not take the form of open war, but of persistent pressure. Russia will target European markets, political parties, energy security, infrastructure, and public opinion. Europe will try to weaken Russia's economy, undermine its attempts to integrate annexed territories, and continue supporting actors within Russia's own neighborhood, especially those that Moscow considers vital to its security. This is why we can expect the future to look less like cooperation and more like managed confrontation. Each side will try to weaken the other carefully, consistently, and just below the threshold of war. European governments will have to manage rising energy costs, inflation, political polarization, stagnant growth, and military rearmament all at the same time. Russia, in contrast, operates within a more centralized political structure with fewer domestic constraints and a clearer strategic direction. It knows its priorities: secure territory, reduce Western influence, and maintain leverage over its neighbors. The imbalance is clear. Europe is increasingly focused on internal stability. Russia is focused on external influence, and history suggests that when one actor is fighting its own fragmentation while the other acts with strategic clarity, the latter tends to gain ground. Russia has demonstrated it is willing to pursue long-term goals even at high cost. Europe, by contrast, must constantly answer to short-term electoral cycles, media narratives, coalition politics, and budget constraints. That difference alone creates a significant strategic advantage for Moscow. In today's geopolitical landscape, endurance is power, and endurance is precisely what democratic systems often struggle to maintain. This dynamic leads to an uncomfortable conclusion. Even if active fighting in Ukraine stops, the European continent will not return to stability. The war will formally end, but the confrontation will remain alive. Europe will try to prevent Russia from consolidating gains. Russia will do everything possible to ensure that Ukraine remains politically unstable and economically weak. Both sides will compete, not negotiate. The key point is this: once hostility becomes structural, it becomes self-sustaining. It no longer depends on leaders or governments. It becomes embedded in national narratives, strategic doctrines, military planning, and public opinion. And when hostility becomes doctrine, peace becomes a temporary phase rather than a long-term objective. Europe and Russia are entering a period of strategic animosity, one that is likely to endure for decades. The channels for cooperation are closing, trust has evaporated, and both sides are preparing tacitly or explicitly for a future in which confrontation must be managed, not eliminated. That brings us to the next essential question. If this hostility is permanent, where could it explode next? The answer lies in 6 regions, each one volatile, each one strategic, and each one capable of triggering direct conflict between Russia and one or more European states. Even if the war in Ukraine stops, Europe will not return to stability. A ceasefire would not end the confrontation. It would only relocate it. The hostility between Europe and Russia has entered a phase where neither side expects cooperation. They expect resistance. And when resistance becomes a default condition, it begins searching for new terrain. That is why the end of the fighting in Ukraine does not mean the end of danger. It may simply mean the beginning of a new phase in different parts of the map. There are 6 regions in particular where a direct confrontation between Russia and one or more European states could emerge quickly with little warning. Each of these regions is strategic. Each contains overlapping interests, and each sits at the edge of a geopolitical fault line that could shift suddenly. The first is the Arctic. For most of history, it was an unreachable space, but melting ice has turned it into a zone of valuable passageways and resources. 7 of the 8 countries that physically border the Arctic are NATO members. Russia is the 8th. That means Moscow is outnumbered 7-1 in a region that is rapidly becoming militarized. Trade routes, surveillance networks, and energy reserves will shape the future of this area. As they do, tension will increase. Russia views the Arctic as a long-term opportunity. NATO increasingly sees it as a new front line. The second is the Baltic Sea, often described as a NATO lake. Most of the coastline now belongs to NATO states, including Finland and Sweden. But for Russia, this body of water remains essential for maritime access and security. Kinrad, the Russian enclave trapped between NATO members, is a particular point of pressure. European military planners have already discussed how to isolate it in the event of conflict. Moscow is well aware of that. The Baltic region is not yet a crisis zone, but it has moved much closer to becoming one. The third flashpoint is Belarus. Its geographical position makes it as valuable to Russia as Ukraine ever was. It is Moscow's shield against the West, a buffer state that cannot be surrendered without strategic consequence. Western capitals may eventually attempt to encourage political change in Minsk once the current leadership leaves office. But any move to install a pro-European or pro-American government there would be interpreted in Moscow as an unacceptable threat. Russia is unlikely to tolerate it peacefully. Belarus may not be at war, but it is already part of the battlefield. The fourth is Moldova, specifically the breakaway region of Transnistria where Russian troops are already stationed. Western influence in Moldova has grown. Russian influence has not disappeared, but it is under pressure. This region rarely appears in headlines, yet it represents an unusual reality. Russian forces operating on European territory surrounded by states aligned with NATO. If Moldova continues to move toward the west, this quiet front may become far louder. The fifth is the Black Sea. It is crowded with strategic interests. Russian, Ukrainian, European, and NATO. Bulgaria, Romania, Greece, and Turkey all have interests there. Naval forces from both sides operate regularly in the areas. Trade routes, energy corridors, and undersea cables all pass through that maritime space. It is a complex theater filled with surveillance systems, military assets, and overlapping security claims. In such a theater, a single miscalculation could escalate quickly. The final flashpoint lies between Lithuania and Poland in a narrow stretch of land known as the Sochi Gap. It connects NATO's Baltic members to the rest of the alliance and separates Kaliningrad from Belarus. In the event of conflict, this corridor would become a critical target. It is one of the most vulnerable points on the entire European map. Linking NATO's presence to the Baltic states makes it vital. Potentially severing that link makes it dangerous. These regions are not theoretical concerns. They already contain structural tensions. They already hold overlapping interests, and they already reflect the new strategic condition of Europe, a condition where hostility is not a temporary phase but a long-term environment. When strategy replaces diplomacy, pressure replaces dialogue, and when pressure becomes systemic, peace becomes an interruption rather than a destination. The war in Ukraine may freeze, but the conflict that shaped it, the one between Russia and Europe, will not. It will continue to move across borders, adapting to geography, waiting for openings. And while external pressure matters, internal fractures may ultimately matter even more. Because the next question Europe must face is not only where tensions will rise, but how well it can withstand them from within. Europe is not just facing pressure from outside, it is facing pressure from within, and that pressure may prove far more difficult to manage than any external threat. Because while Russia can be deterred, internal instability cannot be contained with troops or treaties. It follows its own logic. It grows beneath the surface, and it spreads through politics, prices, and public confidence. A Russian victory in Ukraine, even an incomplete and costly one, would be a strategic defeat for Europe. NATO has been deeply involved in the war from the beginning. The alliance promised to weaken Russia, defend Ukraine, and prevent Moscow from reshaping the security order of the continent. If Ukraine ultimately loses territory and emerges as a diminished state, that promise will appear to have failed. The question of responsibility will quickly rise to the surface. Who miscalculated? Who insisted on a strategy that could not be sustained? Who promised what could not be delivered? Those questions will not be directed at Moscow. They will be directed at the capitals of Europe. And when blame enters politics, it rarely stays contained. Many European states already struggle with fractured political landscapes, polarized electorates, unstable coalition governments, protests driven by cost of living crisis, rising energy prices, and declining economic growth. In that environment, the question of who lost Ukraine will introduce a powerful new fault line. Some will blame Washington, some will blame Brussels, some will blame domestic leaders. Others will argue that Ukraine should never have been promised what could not be given. That debate will not calm the political climate. It will intensify it. Energy remains another source of pressure. The sharp reduction of Russian gas and oil has reshaped economic calculations across the continent. Industries have had to adjust or shut down. Households have faced rising costs. Governments have had to redirect budgets to subsidies and emergency measures. Growth has slowed in major economies, and recovery looks uncertain. Europe requires stable energy supplies to maintain stable politics. It no longer has them. Security will demand more spending. Public welfare will demand more spending. and the need to rearm for the first time on a significant scale since the Cold War will compete with the need to repair social services. As resources are stretched, electoral tensions will grow. Defense budgets rarely win votes, but without them, strategic credibility erodes. All of this will occur in a political environment where trust in governing institutions is already fragile. The last decade has seen rising skepticism toward elites, growing distrust in media narratives, and the spread of political movements that challenge the traditional center. A military defeat in Ukraine, or even a perceived failure of strategy, will not reverse those trends. It will accelerate them. Some will argue for greater autonomy from Washington. Others will demand closer alignment with it. Some will call for diplomatic engagement with Moscow. Others will call for isolation. What they will not likely find is consensus. And when consensus disappears, long-term strategy becomes very difficult to maintain. The European Union will also feel the strain. Its stability depends on economic strength and security confidence. Both will be weakened by the outcome of this war. If NATO appears less capable, the EU appears less protected. If member states struggle economically, the Union faces new friction. Integration requires trust. Crisis tests it. Europe is entering a moment where three forces converge. Pressure from Moscow, fragmentation among allies, and uncertainty about America's long-term commitment. Each one on its own would be manageable. Together they reshape the entire strategic landscape. What follows from this convergence is not collapse, but a long period of adjustment. A shift from ambition to management, from optimism to realism, from external commitment to internal consolidation. Europe will not fall, but it may have to contract its expectations for what it can achieve beyond its borders while it works to stabilize itself within them. And that leads to one more question, one that will define the coming decade. If the United States begins to reduce its role in Europe, or even signals that it might, how will Europe respond? Will it attempt to build its own independent security structure? Will it increase military cooperation between member states? Or will it struggle to do either while domestic politics demand attention elsewhere? That question cannot wait. It is already arriving because geopolitics does not pause when societies need time to repair themselves. It advances, it waits for openings, it tests resolve. In Europe, having invested so heavily in Ukraine, will soon have to prove whether its resolve remains intact or whether it was built on assumptions that no longer hold. The question Europe must soon confront is not only what Russia intends to do, but what the United States intends not to do. Washington has supported Kiev with resources, intelligence, weapons, and diplomatic backing, but political commitment is not the same as strategic permanence. And permanence is exactly what Europe may not be able to count on anymore. The United States now faces a different structure of international power. For the first time in decades, it must divide its attention between multiple regions simultaneously. The era of unipolarity is over. China has emerged as a major competitor. The Indo-Pacific has become a central theater of strategic concern. The logic of superpower management points toward Asia, and in that shift, Europe becomes a secondary priority. That change may not happen with rhetoric. It may happen with budgets, deployments, and quiet reallocations of attention. Strategic pivots do not always begin with declarations. They often begin with silence. The war in Ukraine accelerated this process. Washington has already pressed European governments to carry more of the burden, more funding, more weapons, more training, more responsibility. If Ukraine ultimately emerges weakened or partitioned, that burden will not disappear. It will increase. And in that moment, the question of who failed whom will likely dominate the transatlantic dialogue. Europe may argue that the U.S. reduced its commitment too soon. The war may freeze, the borders may settle, but the consequences will keep moving. Europe now stands at a crossroads where every decision has a cost, and doing nothing may cost the most.